I always thought summer breaks were supposed to be about lazy mornings, endless lemonade, and maybe the occasional trip to the beach with friends. That's what I'd been looking forward to all year. But when Mom told me I'd be spending the next 3 months at Grandpa's old farm in Cedar Hollow instead, my heart sank. Cedar Hollow wasn't a place you went for excitement. It wasn't even on the map unless you zoomed way in. The farm itself was surrounded by nothing but miles of golden wheat fields and an occasional barn that looked like it had been standing since the 1800s. Grandpa's place had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and a smell that was somewhere between fresh hay and old wood. 3 months? I'd groaned when Mom broke the news. Mom, I'll die of boredom before I even unpack. You won't die, she said with that patient parental tone. And Grandpa could use the company. He's been alone since Grandma passed. I didn't argue after that. I couldn't. Grandma's death last winter had been hard on all of us, but Grandpa had taken it the hardest. I guess maybe being there would be good for him. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being exiled to the middle of nowhere. The day I arrived, Grandpa was already waiting at the porch in his faded overalls, his weathered hands gripping the railing. His face lit up when he saw me. Well, if it isn't City Girl herself, he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like tobacco and engine oil. I guess that's me, I mumbled, trying to smile. The first few days passed exactly as I'd predicted, slow, repetitive, and dull. I'd wake up early to the sound of roosters instead of alarm clocks, help Grandpa feed the chickens, and then spend the afternoons reading old paperbacks I found on a dusty bookshelf. Every evening, Grandpa would sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea, staring at the sunset like it was the only thing worth looking at for hours. The barn was my least favorite part of the farm. It was massive, looming at the edge of the property, with weather-beaten red paint peeling in long strips. Grandpa kept most of his tools there, along with stacks of hay bales, old tractor parts, and random junk that hadn't been touched in years. It was on my 5th day there that I noticed something odd. I was stacking hay in the barn when my foot bumped against something solid beneath a tarp in the far corner. I pulled the tarp back, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. There it was, a large, weather-worn trunk. It was made of dark wood reinforced with rusty iron bands. A heavy padlock hung from the latch, and the metal was so corroded it looked like it might crumble at a touch. But it didn't. I gave it a tug, locked solid. Grandpa, I called out, curiosity already sparking in my chest. What's in this trunk? For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard slow footsteps approaching. Grandpa's shadow fell across me as he stepped into the corner. He looked at the trunk like it was something alive. That's just old stuff, he said flatly. Nothing you need to worry about. Old stuff? I pressed. Like what? He cleared his throat. Tools. Clothes. Things from before you were born. Then he reached for the tarp and pulled it back over the trunk with more force than necessary. Leave it alone, okay? Some things are better left where they are. His tone was final. I nodded, but something about his eyes unsettled me. It wasn't just annoyance, it was fear. That night at dinner, I tried to bring it up casually. So, what kind of things do people keep in trunks like that? Grandpa didn't look up from his plate. Old things, he repeated. Things that don't need digging up. After that, he changed the subject to the weather. I went to bed that night with the sound of crickets outside my window, my mind spinning. Why would Grandpa care so much about an old trunk? And why lock it? I didn't know much about his life before Mom was born. He never talked about it. Grandma used to tell stories about growing up in Cedar Hollow, but they were always about summer picnics, town dances, and harmless mischief. Nothing worth hiding. But this trunk. It felt like a door to something he didn't want me to open. Over the next few days, I found myself glancing toward the barn every time I walked past. I told myself it was none of my business, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more it itched in the back of my mind. One afternoon, while Grandpa was napping on the porch, I went back to the barn. The trunk sat there like it was waiting for me. I crouched beside it, running my fingers over the grain of the wood. The padlock was old but sturdy. I tugged on it again, but it didn't budge. That's when I noticed something strange. The initials carved faintly into the side of the trunk. They weren't Grandpa's. They weren't Grandma's either. CRM. I whispered them under my breath. I didn't recognize them at all. A shiver ran down my spine. Whoever this trunk had belonged to, it wasn't anyone I knew about. And if Grandpa had been hiding it all these years. I didn't realize it then, but that moment was the beginning. The beginning of a summer I would never forget. The beginning of pulling on a thread that would unravel not just my family's past, but my understanding of who my grandfather really was. I thought I'd come to Cedar Hollow to escape city life for a while. But the truth? I'd stepped into the middle of a story that had been buried for half a century, one that certain people had sworn would never be told again. And I was about to be the one to tell it. I couldn't get those initials out of my head. CRM. They looped through my mind all night, like a puzzle I wasn't supposed to solve. By morning, I'd convinced myself I wouldn't think about it anymore. Grandpa clearly didn't want me near that trunk, and maybe he had a good reason. But then breakfast happened. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits. Grandpa barely said 2 words, his gaze fixed on the morning paper. Normally, he'd at least comment on the weather or tell me what chores needed doing. But that morning, it was like I wasn't even there. Grandpa, I said finally, did you ever know someone with the initials CRM? He froze. Just a tiny pause, so quick most people wouldn't notice. But I did. His hand tightened on the edge of the paper before he lowered it slowly. Where'd you hear that? I hesitated. I could lie. But my face has always been a terrible liar. They're on the trunk in the barn. His jaw clenched. I told you to leave that trunk alone. I didn't open it, I said quickly. I just saw the letters. Who were they? He pushed his chair back from the table with a loud scrape. That's none of your concern. You're here to help me with the farm, not dig up the past. And that was the end of breakfast. He walked out, leaving his coffee untouched. The thing about telling someone not to do something is that it usually guarantees they'll do it. Especially if you're a 17-year-old stuck in the middle of nowhere with nothing else to do. Later that afternoon, while Grandpa was fixing the tractor on the far side of the property, I slipped into the barn again. I ran my fingers over the carved letters. CRM. Who had been important enough to have their initials etched into something this heavy, this permanent? That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The trunk wasn't sitting directly on the floor, it was on a pair of old, flat boards, like someone had wanted to keep it off the dirt. And wedged between one of the boards and the trunk was a small, folded scrap of paper. My heart kicked in my chest as I pulled it free. The paper was yellowed and brittle, like it might fall apart in my hands. Carefully, I unfolded it. It was a photograph. A black and white one, the kind with scalloped edges. In it, there was a young man in work clothes, leaning against the very same barn door I was standing near now. He had the kind of smile that was more confident than kind. Next to him stood a young woman in a floral dress, holding a straw hat. Her eyes, even in black and white, seemed to shine. And between them was a little boy, maybe 3 years old, clutching the man's leg. I didn't recognize any of them. On the back, written in looping handwriting, were the words, Summer, 1975, our last day here. I read it twice. Our last day here. Here, as in the farm? What had happened that summer? And why had this picture been hidden under the trunk, like someone had tried to keep it secret? Before I could think too much about it, I heard footsteps approaching. My stomach flipped. Grandpa. I shoved the photograph into my back pocket and scrambled toward the ladder leading to the hayloft. From up above, I watched as Grandpa entered the barn. His eyes went straight to the trunk. He walked over, rested a hand on it for a moment, then sighed, the kind of sigh that sounded like it carried 50 years of weight. Then he turned and walked back out without even noticing I was there. That night, I took the photograph out under the dim light of my bedside lamp. The woman in the picture. There was something about her. Something familiar. I tried to imagine her in color, younger maybe, but I couldn't place her face. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course, but I could still use the camera. I snapped a photo of the photograph, just in case. The next day, I decided to try another angle. Grandpa might not talk to me, but maybe someone else in Cedar Hollow would. So when he asked me to go into town to pick up feed from Miller's supply store, I didn't hesitate. Miller's was one of those places that smelled like sawdust and leather. Behind the counter was a wiry man in a plaid shirt, maybe in his late 60s. His name tag read Harold. Feed for Robert Whitaker? I asked, using Grandpa's full name. That's right, Harold said, ringing me up. How's the old man holding up? I hesitated, then pulled the photograph from my pocket. Do you recognize anyone in this picture? The change in Harold's face was instant. His easy smile faded, replaced by something sharper, warier. He glanced at the photo, then back at me. Where'd you get this? It was on the farm, I said carefully. He studied me for a long moment. You're his granddaughter, huh? I nodded. Harold leaned in, lowering his voice. Best you put that picture away. Folks round here don't talk about the summer of '75. Why not? He shook his head. Not my story to tell. But if I were you, I'd leave it alone. There it was again, that same warning, the same wall. Like there was some unwritten rule in Cedar Hollow. You don't talk about whatever happened 50 years ago. I drove back to the farm with more questions than answers. As soon as I got there, I went straight to my room, pulled up the photo on my phone, and zoomed in. The young man's work shirt had faint letters stitched on the pocket, maybe a name. I squinted. It wasn't clear, but it looked like C.R. Miller. Serum. My breath caught. The initials on the trunk weren't just random. They belonged to him. The man in the photo. And if Harold's reaction was anything to go by, C.R. Miller wasn't just anybody. He was someone tied to a story the whole town had buried. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the woman's bright eyes, the little boy's tiny hands clutching his father's leg. What had happened to them? And why did Grandpa have a trunk with this man's initials hidden away? I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stop until I found them. Even if it meant digging up secrets my family had spent 50 years trying to keep hidden. The morning after I connected the initials to the man in the photograph, I woke up with the feeling that the whole farm was watching me. It sounds strange, but it's true. The creak of the floorboards under my feet, the groan of the wind against the shutters, even the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything felt heavier. Grandpa was already outside when I came down, fixing a fence post along the gravel road. I almost went out there to ask him directly, who was C.R. Miller? Why do you have his trunk? Why won't anyone talk about him? But something in me hesitated. If he'd spent 50 years locking those answers away, he wouldn't just hand them over because I asked. I'd need to be smarter. Instead, I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, staring out at the barn. It stood there in the morning light like it always did, but now it was different. That old red paint didn't just look weathered, it looked like it was hiding something. I decided to dig without making it obvious. I'd start small. That afternoon, I helped Grandpa in the workshop, sanding down an old rocking chair that had been sitting in the attic. Did you grow up around here? I asked casually, like it was nothing. Born and raised, he said, not looking up. And Grandma? She moved here when she was 17. What about your friends? Did you have any? People you worked with on the farm? He chuckled. Sure, I had friends. Not many stuck around. This place, well, it has a way of keeping some folks and spitting others out. I nodded like I understood, even though I didn't. Then I went for it. What about someone named C.R. Miller? The sandpaper froze in his hand. His eyes didn't meet mine. Where'd you hear that name? I shrugged. I think I saw it somewhere. For a moment, he just stared at the chair like it was the most important thing in the world. Then he set down the sandpaper. That's a name you let stay in the past, kiddo. The world's got enough trouble without digging up old ghosts. He left the workshop without another word. That night, I sat on the porch long after Grandpa had gone to bed, the air warm and thick with the smell of cut grass. My mind kept circling back to what he'd said. Old ghosts. It wasn't just secrecy, it was pain. And then I remembered Harold at Miller's supply store saying, "Folks round here don't talk about the summer of '75. So I decided to go to someone who wasn't from Cedar Hollow. The next morning, I rode my bike into the next town over, where nobody knew me. There was a tiny public library, and the woman behind the counter looked like she had lived through every story in the building. "Do you have old newspapers?" I asked. "On microfilm," she said, leading me to a dusty corner. Scrolling through those old black and white headlines felt like stepping into another world, one where everyone dressed in polyester and smoked like it was part of breathing. I scanned issue after issue from the summer of 1975, and just when I was about to give up, I saw it. Local farmhand missing, search continues. The article was short, but it was enough to make my hands sweat. Charles Raymond Miller, 26, employed at the Whitaker family farm in Cedar Hollow, has been reported missing after last being seen on the property late Saturday evening. Sheriff's deputies say Miller's disappearance is being treated as suspicious. The Whitaker family farm. My family farm. There was no follow-up article in the next few weeks. It was like the story had just vanished. When I got back to the farm, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Cr. Miller had worked here. He'd disappeared from here. And for some reason, Grandpa had kept a locked trunk with his initials for 50 years. That night after dinner, I went out to the barn with a flashlight. The trunk sat there, quiet and patient. I knelt beside it, running my fingers over the cold iron bands. The lock was still solid. But this time, I noticed something else, a faint, almost invisible seam in the barn wall behind the trunk. I pressed my hand against it, and the wood shifted ever so slightly. My heart pounded. I pushed harder, and a narrow panel swung open just enough for me to see inside. There was a small hollow space between the barn wall and the outer siding. Inside, wrapped in a piece of burlap, was something flat. I pulled it out and unwrapped it slowly. It was a letter, the envelope so fragile I thought it might crumble. On the front, in faded ink, was a name, Margaret Whitaker, my grandmother. I slipped the letter out, and my breath caught as I read. "Maggie, I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Robert's made it clear he doesn't want me around, but you and the boy, you're the only reason I haven't left already. If something happens, know that I loved you both more than anything. Please don't believe whatever they tell you. You know the truth. Charlie. Charlie. Charles Raymond Miller." The boy. The letter slipped from my fingers as I stared at the words. A boy. That could only mean one thing. My mother wasn't Grandpa's only child. Or worse, maybe she wasn't his child at all. I was still sitting there in the dirt when I heard the barn door creak. I looked up and saw Grandpa standing there, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. His eyes went from the trunk to the letter in my lap, and his face changed in a way I'd never seen before. "That's not yours," he said quietly. I didn't move. "Who was he, Grandpa?" His jaw tightened. "Put it back." Was Grandma in love with him? My voice was shaking. "Was the boy?" "Enough," he barked louder than I'd ever heard him. The sound echoed through the barn, scattering the swallows in the rafters. We stared at each other, the silence between us sharp as glass. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the barn door swinging behind him. I sat there in the dark for a long time after that, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Because now I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about an old farmhand going missing. This was about my family, my bloodline. And the truth was about to tear it wide open. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the farmhouse sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters felt like it was trying to tell me something. I kept replaying the words from Charlie's letter in my head. Robert's made it clear he doesn't want me around. You and the boy, Please don't believe whatever they tell you. Robert, Grandpa. The man who taught me how to plant tomatoes and fix a broken fence was the same man Charlie had written about. The man who didn't want him there. The man who might have been standing in the way of a relationship between my grandmother and this mysterious farmhand. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I found Grandpa in the kitchen, pouring coffee. His eyes were bloodshot, like he'd been awake as long as I had. We need to talk, I said. He didn't answer. I slid the letter across the table toward him. You can't keep pretending this didn't happen. His jaw worked as he stared at the envelope, his hands curling around his coffee mug. Where'd you find it? In the barn wall. Hidden. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke, slow, heavy. You don't understand what you're asking, kiddo. Then help me understand. He let out a sharp breath, like the air itself was fighting him. Cedar Hollow was different back then. Small towns have long memories, but they also like their secrets. And Charlie. He didn't belong here. I leaned forward. Why? Because Grandma loved him? His eyes flashed. Watch yourself. I sat back, but I didn't look away. Was the boy in the letter my mom? For the first time, he looked afraid. This isn't a story with a happy ending. I'm not asking for a happy ending, I said. I'm asking for the truth. He stood abruptly and walked out the back door, leaving his coffee steaming on the table. Later that day, I biked back into town, straight to the Miller's supply store. Harold was behind the counter again, sorting nails into little paper bags. I know he worked here, I said without preamble. Charlie. C.R. Miller. And I know he disappeared in 1975. What happened? Harold froze mid-scoop, then set the bag down. You're not gonna stop asking, are you? No. He rubbed his jaw. You want the truth, you're asking the wrong person. But there's someone who might tell you more. His sister, Lydia, lives out by the old mill road. Folks say she hasn't left that house in years. I didn't waste time. By mid-afternoon, I was coasting down a gravel lane, the sun heavy on my back. The house at the end looked like it had been holding itself together out of sheer stubbornness. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged in the middle. When I knocked, it took a long time for the door to open. A thin woman in her 70s stood there, her sharp eyes scanning me up and down. You're a Whittaker, she said flatly. Yes, I admitted. I'm Robert's granddaughter. Her eyes narrowed. Then you've got nerve showing up here. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I just want to know what happened to your brother. She studied me for a long, tense moment. Then she stepped aside. You'd better come in. Inside, the air smelled like dust and lavender. Old photographs lined the mantel, some black and white, some faded color, and in nearly all of them, I saw the same confident smile I'd seen in the barn photo. Charlie. Lydia lowered herself into an armchair and gestured for me to sit. Charlie was a good man. Too good for that farm. He started working there when your grandma's health was failing. Helped with the fields, the animals. Always laughing, always singing. Your grandmother. She was lonely. Her gaze sharpened. And your grandfather. He noticed. I swallowed hard. One night, the sheriff said Charlie just vanished. They found his truck abandoned near the river. Folks whispered all sorts of things, that he ran off with another woman, that he got into trouble in the city. But I never believed it. Charlie wouldn't have left without telling me. And he sure wouldn't have left your grandmother. I hesitated. Did he? Was the boy in his letter? Yes, she cut in, her voice steady. That boy was your mother. The room tilted around me. My mother? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She was his daughter, Lydia said. But your grandfather claimed her as his own. Told everyone she was his. In a place like Cedar Hollow, appearances matter more than truth. I sat there, stunned. Lydia leaned forward. I think your grandfather had something to do with Charlie's disappearance. And if you're smart, you'll keep that to yourself. Men like him. They don't forgive digging up old dirt. When I left Lydia's house, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the road. My hands shook on the handlebars the whole ride back. At the farm, Grandpa was sitting on the porch, his silhouette dark against the fading light. As I walked past him, he said, "You went to see her." I froze. "She's been telling that story for 50 years, he said quietly. "Doesn't make it true." I turned to face him. "Is she lying? Was Charlie my mom's father?" His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his armor. "Go inside," he said. But I didn't move. "Tell me." He stood, and the weight in his movements was like something that had been building for decades. "I told you, kiddo, some truths don't set you free. They just burn everything down." Then he walked past me into the house, leaving me on the porch with my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Lydia's words, about Charlie's letter, about the photograph in my drawer. If what Lydia said was true, then my entire family history was built on a lie, and my grandfather had been the one to keep it alive. But there was still one thing I didn't know. What had happened to Charlie on that last night in 1975? I woke before sunrise, the sky still gray, the air thick and cool. I didn't even know what had pulled me out of sleep, but I felt it, a restless itch that wouldn't let me lie still. If Lydia was telling the truth, then Grandpa hadn't just lied for 50 years. He'd stolen a man's life, a child's father, and a woman's love. But I still didn't know how far he'd gone. The barn felt different that morning, like it knew I was close to the end. I grabbed a crowbar from the tool rack and walked to the trunk. My hands were trembling, but I forced the crowbar into the gap by the lock and pushed with all my strength. The rusty padlock snapped with a sharp crack. For a second, I just stood there, staring at it. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of neatly folded clothes, yellowed at the edges, a pair of work boots, and an old harmonica. Beneath those, wrapped in a sheet, was a bundle of letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Margaret Whittaker. I picked one up and read the first few lines. My heart thudded harder with each word. "Maggie, I know Robert hates me, but I swear I'll make enough to take care of you and the boy. Just give me time. Don't let him keep us apart." Some letters were full of hope. Others sounded desperate. The last one, dated July 14, 1975, was nothing but 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's too late." My hands were still clutching that letter when I heard the barn door creak. "You couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Grandpa stood in the doorway, his face shadowed but his voice sharp. "Tell me what happened," I said. "Tell me everything." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Charlie was trouble," he began. "Not the kind you see right away. He had a way of getting under your skin, making people like him. Your grandmother. She was vulnerable. And I wasn't enough for her." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "When I found out she was pregnant, I married her anyway. I told myself it didn't matter that the child wasn't mine. But then Charlie came back, saying he wanted to take her away, take my life away. I told him to leave. He wouldn't. He looked at the ground. We fought, out by the river. He slipped on the bank, hit his head on the rocks. It was over in seconds. I swallowed hard. You killed him." He flinched at the word, but didn't deny it. "It was an accident. But in a town like this, people wouldn't care about the truth. So I dragged him into the water, let the current take him. Told the sheriff I hadn't seen him. And that was the end of it." My chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air in the barn. "You let his sister believe he just disappeared. You let Mom grow up never knowing her real father." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw the weight he'd been carrying. "I gave her a family. I gave her my name. I kept this farm alive for her. And for you." I shook my head. "You kept it for yourself. You kept it so you wouldn't have to live with the truth." We stood there in silence, the dust swirling between us in the morning light. Then I took the bundle of letters and walked past him, out of the barn. That afternoon, I drove back to Lydia's house. She opened the door before I even knocked. "You found something," she said. I held out the bundle. "They're his. All of them." He never stopped writing to her. Her hands trembled as she took them. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. 50 years, she whispered. 50 years, and now I know. We sat on her porch for a long time. I told her everything about the fight, the river, the accident Grandpa claimed had taken Charlie's life. She didn't interrupt. When I was done, she nodded slowly. "I always knew," she said. "But now I can bury him in my heart the way he deserves." When I got back to the farm, Grandpa was sitting on the porch again, staring at the fields. He didn't look up as I passed. "You told her," he said. "Yes." He closed his eyes, and for a second, I thought he might say something else. But he didn't. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt heavy, complicated, the kind of truth that didn't fix anything, only changed the way you saw it. The farm was still the same. The wheat still swayed in the evening wind. But I knew now that every board, every nail, every inch of this place was built on a story of love, betrayal, and loss. On my last day in Cedar Hollow, I went to the river. The water moved slowly under the morning sun, the rocks slick with moss. I stood there a long time, thinking about a man I'd never met but who had shaped my entire life without me knowing it. I pulled the photograph from my pocket, the one I'd found under the trunk. The young man's confident smile, the woman's shining eyes, the little boy clutching his leg. I laid it gently on the water's surface and watched it float downstream until it disappeared around the bend. Some truths burn everything down. But sometimes, burning it down is the only way to see what was really there all along. And that's how the summer I thought would be nothing but boredom turned into the summer that changed everything. For me, for my family, and for a secret that Cedar Hollow had kept buried for 50 years. Because I found the locked trunk in the barn. And I opened it.